Salam and peace. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and you're watching us on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and we're always on MuslimNetwork.tv. And pretty soon we'll be on Apple TV as well. And I hope you're enjoying it. This is the only Muslim network on television, on satellite, and as well as on social media. This is where Muslim narrative is heard. Our guest could be of any faith, of no faith, experts in their field, unique people. So conversation which takes place here is normally not found on airwaves in America. You know, the world is changing, and there are good people arising with all the evil which see. In Germany, well, in those days, it was East Germany and West Germany, Berlin Wall was coming down. If there were Europe, where the people who fought with each other so long, 27 countries, they were demolishing their borders. But at the same time, checkpoints, walls, and strange roads in Palestine built by Israel was surrounding and dividing communities and brutalizing people. And the world's sole superpower was supporting Israel, and nothing anybody else could do. Now they don't want Jews, Christians, Muslim, or other people who care for peace and justice to do much to oppose that in America through using free speech and different expressions of it. And the world is watching helplessly. But as most people are silent and not worried about what is happening, there are people who continue to speak. There is a risk sometime when you speak. And you have to think before you speak. And this one-sided attack on freedom, liberty, and justice is being checked. And among many of those people, a prominent and close to me, I have been watching him, is a rabbi. And this rabbi stood up with his voice for peace and justice at the height of all that. And one of the sacrifices he has to do is that the synagogue, whose building and people he cherished and helped and developed as good people for 20 years, he had to resign from there. And that's Rabbi Brant Rosen. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, brother.
Thank you, Malik. It's an honor to be here.
Brant Rosen is a rabbi of Sadek Chicago congregation. He resigned from Jewish Reconstructionist congregation, where he served for 20 years, essentially because of his activism in support of peace and justice in Israel and Palestine. He is author of a book, Wrestling in the Daylight, A Rabbi's Path to Palestinian Solidarity. The first time I saw you was in a Baptist church where Reverend Bob Thompson, a mischievous man, has invited a Jew, that's you, and an imam, that's me, a Muslim. And before the service was over, and I saw suddenly you moving forward towards me, and you have this smile in your face, which really to me reflected your open heart. And I said, my goodness, that is my first ever meeting with a rabbi outside the board meeting here and there. So thank you for being a welcoming and a smiling rabbi, brother.
Well, I remember that day very well too. And that's funny to hear you say that, because that's exactly my memory of meeting you as well. I think there was an immediate connection and bond, and it's been a real pleasure and a joy to collaborate you in so many different ways, in so many mischievous ways, as Bob Thompson would have it, over the years since then.
Well, In one of your blog, you write about your conversion process towards Palestinian rights. Why don't you, in the beginning, share with us what was it like? Where were you? Where you are? Where are you heading?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting to hear you use the word conversion, because usually, at least in my religious tradition, conversion is a religious phenomenon. But I guess you could say on a deeper level, perhaps it was a kind of conversion, because I grew up very much believing in Zionism, very much believing in the importance of a Jewish state in historic Palestine. I was born in 1963, so that was less than 20 years after the birth of the State of Israel. And the birth of the State of Israel following the Holocaust, following one of the greatest tragedies to befall the Jewish people, certainly in modern times, and certainly in centuries, the birth of a state, an independent Jewish state out of the ashes of the Holocaust, was just a very important and powerful narrative, even for Jews who were not religious. Has a kind of that narrative has a kind of religious power, because it's a story of rebirth. It's a story of redemption. It's a story of people coming out of great tragedy and rebuilding something out of the ashes of that tragedy. So I grew up very much just embedded in that narrative. It was a very important part of my Jewish identity, as it was and continues to be for many American Jews, many Jews around the world. And I accepted that as part of my own Jewish identity and my own Jewish training. And for me, it was also personal, because I have family members in Israel. I visited Israel for the first time when I was young. And I would say there are many different kinds of Zionists. I was what I would have called then a liberal Zionist. I believed in the importance of a Jewish state, but also believed that I didn't deny that the birth of this state happened through the dispossession of other peoples, just the way that the birth of this country, the United States, was as well. But there was a kind of rationalization about the facts of that birth. And when you described in your introduction, the walls coming down in Europe, but the walls, there are walls come down and new walls come up. And Israel was founded in the wake of World War II, and it was also the same year that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed. So it's really interesting to me that we have these two poles. One was a retrenching back into a kind of ethnic nationalism at the same time as the notion of universal human rights and universal brotherhood and sisterhood was really starting to blossom. But there were also walls going up in Europe too, right? I mean, as you mentioned, in East and West Germany. But the thing about walls is they go up, but they also come down. We know that from history. At any rate, my conversion was not a one-time thing, so to speak. It happened over many, many years, and a long process of evolution and discernment and confronting the reality of the dispossession of Palestinians, and that it wasn't just a one-time thing that happened in 1948. And the refugee problem that was created through the birth of the State of Israel, but it was an ongoing dispossession. That there was very strong design by governments of Israel to create a demographically Jewish state, and in order to do that, the presence of non-Jews is a problem and needs to be dealt with in some fashion. And what I came to understand over many years is that this wasn't just a conflict. This was a conflict supposes or assumes, that you have a level playing field. You have two sides that are disagreeing over a piece of land, and that there needs to be some kind of arbitration between the two sides to resolve that conflict. It wasn't a conflict paradigm in the end for me. It ended up evolving into an oppression paradigm, for lack of a better term. That this was not about two equal sides. This was about one side oppressing the other and having power over the other and wielding its power in oppressive ways. And to solve that kind of a problem, it's not just a question of dividing up the map differently and creating a state for this place, people, and a state for that people, but it's really about the side that has created the injustice to confront its injustice and to confess it. I think we have examples of this throughout history. South Africa is none of them are perfect examples, but when we look at South Africa on the fall of apartheid, there was a truth and reconciliation process in which the oppressor owned up to its injustices against the South African people, the Black South African people. And there has been an inability so far among many Jews, and certainly in the state of Israel, to see the problem through that lens. And for me, that's eventually, I couldn't see it any other way. And I made a transition from being a liberal Zionist who was advocating for a peace process that I felt was fairly hollow and ineffective and hypocritical, to advocating for Palestinians as a solidarity activist. And I had been in my congregation in Evanston for about 10 years up until that point. And the first time I really spoke out was in 2008 during one of Israel's military onslaughts against the Palestinians in Gaza. There have been a few more since then, but I spoke out pretty strongly and accused Israel of war crimes, as the UN ended up doing as well. And you said in your introduction that you think before you speak out, but I think also sometimes there's not complete discernment. There's not a complete thought process. There's just this feeling like I can't do it. There's nothing else I can do. I can't just sit by. I can't just rationalize this away. If this is wrong, and I need to call it out as wrong. And I didn't completely think out all of the details of what that would mean for me. But what it did mean for me was, for many years after that, we found a way in my congregation to coexist, including many, many congregants who didn't agree with me, and also congregants who were deeply pained by what I was doing and saying, until the point that it was just impossible for me to continue. And I ended up, as you said, resigning in 2014. I wasn't there for 20 years per se. It was more like 16, 17 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you realize that you're no longer a Zionist?
I don't know that I could point to one day or one moment, but I do think that once I switched over to that narrative, that this wasn't just a conflict and an occupation that needed to be ended, but that this was an injustice that needed to be atoned for. All of my basic premises of what Zionism is really fell away. And I would say, I remember writing an article for Al Jazeera that had the headline, "Why I'm Not a Zionist," and this was probably in 2013 or something like that. So probably 2012, 2013, I became more and more emboldened and more comfortable saying out loud that I'm not a Zionist. And it's interesting. Zionism, it's really important to note this, that Zionism and Judaism are not the same thing. Zionism is a political movement that was founded in the 19th century.
Well, that was my question coming up. Are there people who use the teaching of Judaism to question and challenge Zionism?
Absolutely. And there was from the very beginning of Zionism. From the very beginning of the founding of the Zionist idea and the Zionist movement by Theodor Herzl in the late 19th century, there were Jewish opponents of Zionism. The Reform movement at the time was fiercely anti-Zionist. And they said, we don't want to create this Jewish state where Jewish identity is focused. We see Jews can be Jews and find God wherever they live in the world. And it's a much more of a universal faith tradition. There are also ultra-Orthodox Jews to this day who oppose Zionism because, according to the tenets of traditional Judaism, a Jewish commonwealth, the third Jewish commonwealth, as it were, would only be founded when the Messiah came, and that it was sacrilegious. It is sacrilegious to force God's hand by creating that state now through human endeavor. So you have many ultra-Orthodox Jews, Neturei Karta, for example, is an example of one of those sects that many of whom live in Israel, who are strongly anti-Zionist as well. So there have always been Jewish opponents of Zionism. That's very important to be aware of. And I would say among younger generations of Jews today, there is a separating now, an ease and a more comfort of separating the two in ways that did not exist before.
As we take a short break, this is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Rabbi Brant Rosen, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. We'll be back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with my friend Rabbi Brant Rosen. Before the break, we were talking about the younger people. So my question will be that how much, there are two questions, and you decide how you want to answer. How much Judaism is different from your father's generation to your children's generation? And the second question is, how much Jews are different from one generation to the other?
Wow, those are two enormous questions, but I'll take them in order. Because I think maybe the first one is only slightly more straightforward. My parents grew up, they were children, but they remembered the Holocaust. And it was a huge trauma for those who lived through it, and for the Jews who, certainly for European Jews, but also for Jews around the world. And I remember my mother telling me stories. There's one in particular she would tell me that, when she was a little girl, she would go to the movies, and she went to a movie one day, and there was newsreel footage, before the film, as there was in those days, and there was newsreel footage of the liberation of the camps, of the death camps in Europe, and very graphic footage of bodies stacked up, and these inmates being let out.
Bodies.
Yes, horrible images. And she tells me she ran screaming from the theater and ran home. Her maiden name was Israel, by the way. So she was always singled out for being Jewish and experienced anti-Semitism from her friends and peers. And so she ran home crying to her mother, saying, "Is this going to happen to us?" And those kinds of experiences, I think, deeply affected a generation, at least one generation of Jews, certainly the ones who lived through it. And
would you mind, Brand, how old was she at that time?
So she was born in 1933, and we're talking about probably 1946, I guess, 45, 46. Yeah. So, a child, but old enough to understand what was going on. So, the fact that she would tell this story to me as an adult, and what it meant to her, and I think, for many of her generation, Israel represented, as I was saying before, the redemptive event for Jews, that it came out of the trauma of the Holocaust. And as a result, the narrative, and I referred to this before as a narrative, this redemptive narrative was enormously powerful and shaped Jewish identity throughout the United States, certainly American Jews, in very powerful ways that only grew over time. And so the fact that, Israel was, as I said before, was created through the dispossession of people who lived in that land, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forced from their homes and not allowed to return and turned into refugees. And that now we have the world's largest refugee population as a result. None of that was part of the narrative. Or if it was, we sort of made excuses for it. The way that we make excuses in American history classes with children about the birth of this country. That may be starting to change, but I didn't learn about, when I learned about the Pilgrims coming to Plymouth Rock, I didn't learn about what really happened to the indigenous population of this country. Because that American narrative is just so powerful and goes so deep. And I think nationalist narratives, they're not truthful. They're not historically accurate. You know, they're mythic, and sometimes in very toxic ways. So, you know, I think over time, the next generations, I'm probably a transitionary generation between that kind of Judaism and of young people today who are growing up, and that narrative just doesn't work anymore. They look at Israel and they see a over-militarized state in the Middle East that is making common cause with some of the most odious world actors in the world, probably including this country as well. And they're saying, why should I put this country at the center of my Jewish identity? You know, I'm an American Jew. Why should I make apologies for it? I should be out there as a Jew because they're doing this in my name as a Jew. I should be out there protesting. And increasingly, you're seeing more and more young Jews writing a new narrative about what it means to be Jewish. And it doesn't include Jewish political nationalism at its center anymore, because it's just impossible to assume that narrative, the old narrative, will be so compelling anymore.
Is this the growing trend, or it is some people feel strongly about it and others are not quite relate to it?
It's a growing trend. Every Jewish community study, population study, there's a very famous demographic study done by the Pew Foundation. Increasingly, every study that's done about the politics and the beliefs and the nature of the American Jewish community is showing that younger generations do not feel that sense of connection to Israel that generations have. Now, they may not express it with through a fierce political activism necessarily, but that is beginning too. There's organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now, which are led increasingly by younger people, by younger Jews, for the reasons that I just said. And those numbers are increasing. You know, when I left my former congregation, I felt Jewish Voice for Peace existed, and it became a very important organizational home for me. But it has grown by leaps and bounds since then. In many ways, when I left my congregation in 2014, I felt a little bit in the wilderness Jewishly. I don't feel in the wilderness anymore. There is a Jewish movement and a Jewish world and a kind of Judaism. We're trying to create that. We're working on creating that in my new congregation that sees solidarity with all oppressed people, including Palestinians, as a sacred act. And that movement, both political and religious, is only growing, I would claim.
The people which you left in the last congregation, of course, they are in the same area where you live. I mean, you are still in the more or less the same areas. What type of questions do they ask?
Well, I still have a good relationship with many former members, and actually I have a very good relationship with some of the younger, people I've known since they were in preschool, who are now in college or out of college, and who are paying more attention to me than I kind of thought at the time. And they'll reach out to me because they're struggling with issues around Israel and Palestine, and want to know what they should do with these feelings. And I remember several years ago receiving an email from a young man who was at Northwestern University here in Evanston. And he wrote to me and said, Rabbi Rosen, you may not remember me, but you did my bar mitzvah many years ago. And I'm now a student at Northwestern. I'm part of a group called Students for Justice in Palestine. and we're spearheading a boycott resolution, a divestment resolution at the university, and we want you to come speak in favor of the resolution. And I thought, wow, that's a real sign of the times. You know, a young man whose bar mitzvah I did reached out to his rabbi to come help pass a divestment resolution at his university. So I get lots of those kinds of, I have lots of those kinds of interactions with young people. I have, I speak with others who continue to struggle with this issue and maybe aren't ready quite yet to go to the places I've gone, but are still struggling and want to talk about it. And then there are people who just won't have anything to do with me. Not many, but some of my fiercest opponents, and that's fine. You know, I'm not their rabbi anymore. They don't have to worry about that. What I say and do is going to reflect on them.
You're not rabbi anymore. You are rabbi.
I am a rabbi. I'm not their rabbi. And that was part of the problem. You know, they were deeply pained by what I was saying. You know, for a country that for them was a center of their identity, I was out in the community accusing it of war crimes and calling it an oppressor and saying it basically it needed to be dismantled. And that was horribly painful. And even though I would always take pains to say, I'm only speaking for myself, I don't speak for my entire congregation, there's a diversity of opinions, it was still their rabbi who was saying these things. And I understood that. I understood how that made them feel. And which is one of the reasons why I had to end up leaving, because, you know, you want to be able to feel like you can trust your rabbi. And Israel-Palestine is still the most emotionally fraught issue in the Jewish world today. The stakes are very, very high when you go out on a limb and speak your mind about it.
Tell me this, that the people who are Jew, but they don't quite agree with you, I mean, there must be a group of people who are neither a strong supporter of Israel nor strong in opposition of Palestinians. And do they ask you any questions about why you change, how you change? And I mean, are there some room of conversation? From one side is BDS, or the other side is strong Zionist. What is the room in the middle? I mean, people in politics in America say that these are the moderates who tilt the balance from one side to the other between conservatives and liberals. Are there some buffer zone like this?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. You know, and there are many American Jews for whom their central areas of political concern and activity are more domestically focused. You know, for instance, what we're seeing going on today, the anti-racist protests and the anti-Black Lives Matter movement, that feel that because America is our home, we should be more politically involved in domestic issues, in issues that face us as American Jews. And, you know, they're saying, they will often ask me, why are you so focused on this country over there when there's so much to do right here in our own backyard? And my feeling is that these things are connected. You know, our country is the largest donor of military aid and economic aid to Israel in the world. And Israel acts in the names of all Jews everywhere. So I don't think it's possible to ignore what's going on there. But I also understand, and I don't disagree, that there is a great deal of justice organizing and activism as Jews that we need to be focused on in this country as well. But I don't see it as an either or thing. You know, I often get asked as well, and these were questions I used to ask, that when I argue against a two-state solution, and I argue for one democratic state of all its citizens between the river and the sea, that's, you know, the so-called one-state solution, that having an ethnically Jewish state is inherently racist, right? Because it inherently favors one group of people over another. And a two-state solution, which is separating two states based on the groups in which those people happen to belong, is a solution of segregation. It's saying, okay, well, we need to separate these two peoples because they can't live together. And as American Jews, you know, we got over segregation a long time ago. We marched, you know, with with King and with Lewis, in the streets to oppose segregation. And so how can we draw upon that legacy and yet somehow advocate for segregation through this liberal notion, quote unquote, of a two-state solution? And so I came to the conclusion that what is wrong with saying everybody who lives there, whether they're Jewish or not, should be citizens? What's so radical about that? What's so problematic by saying it should be a state for all who live there? And
we can say, well, it should be like America, in which everybody can live, and at least until now.
Yeah, why is that okay and understood and accepted here, but somehow it's not possible there? And the answer that many people would give, and that I would probably give too, is that Israeli Jews and Palestinians just will not be able to live together. They will. This is just asking for a future of violence and animosity between these two peoples. How do you think that in one state all of these peoples could live together equally in harmony? And I find that to be a really, I've come to and I still get asked that question. How do you really think that Jews and non-Jewish Palestinians can live together in one unified state? And I've come to realize that's the same question that during the abolition of slavery in this country was asked about African Americans. As soon as we give them their freedom, as soon as we emancipate them, they're going to turn around and start murdering white people. That was the argument that was made in South Africa with the fall of apartheid, that we're just dooming this country for permanent civil war. And these things did not happen. It doesn't mean that there was a perfect society created in the after the dismantling of these systems, but it was a darn sight better than what existed before. And I truly believe that that the answer to that question, and I get asked that question still by otherwise seemingly liberal, progressive people, saying, how can you argue for equal rights for everybody? Isn't that just asking for a future of violence? I find that there to be kind of a racist subtext to that.
Yeah,
that question.
that question itself. A lot of Muslim kids get asked, "Are you Muslim first or American first?"
Mm-hmm.
So somebody asked me that question, and all the places that question first was asked to me in Pakistan: "Are you Pakistani first or Muslim first?"
Mm-hmm.
So I say, what type of question is that? Compare apple to apple, oranges to oranges.
Yeah.
What are you doing? But Rabbi, thank you so much for being with us. Let's take a short break and we'll continue our conversation. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Rabbi Brant Rosen, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Rabbi Brant Rosen, and you're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, as well as Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and many other places, including MuslimNetwork.tv, our website. As a child growing up in America, the America of 60s was not that kind place either. Were you asked this question, are you Jews first or an American first?
I don't personally get asked that question, but I'm sure there are those. That question is a subtext for many in this country, not just for me, but for many peoples who.
Yeah, Catholics were asked that question.
Yes, absolutely, and I refuse to honor the assumptions behind that question, the binary that somehow, because it's a zero sum, it assumes a zero sum game, right? It assumes you can only be one or the other, or you can be one first or not, or one secondary. And I just refuse to play that game. You know, the point of, as I understand it, of the most maybe sacred point of the American experiment is that this is a place for everybody. You know, that this is, we've never been that. We're struggling hard to live up to that, certainly, and it certainly was created through the dispossession of peoples and the enslavement of other peoples. But at the heart, there is at least this aspirational notion that there should be a state, a nation state for all people, no matter what they look like, no matter what group they belong to, no matter what religion they adhere to, and that's why I just refuse to countenance a question like that.
Rabbi, there is a slight level of tension there that you're against Zionism, I'm against nationalism. Both to me are the same thing. I mean, it's a different narrative and all that, but you know, nationalism has created havoc around the world. I mean, probably it has killed more people than anything else. And it continuously does that. I mean, it is built into some type of history. But at the same time, we have been talking for the last 30, 40 minutes about one nation for all people. So when you talk about one nation, I mean, I'm not just talking about the Palestinian and Israelis living in one place peacefully together in one state. But whole notion of nationalism, theoretically speaking, is connected with nationalism, isn't it?
Yes.
And if we ask for a solution which is for a state or for a nation, it doesn't, I mean, it's a different thing that who will be living in there. But I think, do you think we can survive by saying that at least all people living with equal right in a state is a way to diminish nationalism itself? Can we make that argument?
I think we have to make that argument. And by the way, you know, nationalism, the way we're talking about it, again, the way I talked about Zionism, and I referred to it as a very modern movement. The notion of nationalism, the way we're talking about it, is a very modern concept. You know, the notion that one group of people, whether it's an ethnic group or a religious group, founds a nation, a political nation state, through the identity, based on the identity of that group of people. That kind of that's a modern notion. That was, that was born largely in Europe in the modern period in the 16th, 17th century.
And they fought for 300 years, and it brought the World War to the people. Right,
absolutely. And that's not to say everything was rosy before that. I mean, groups of people have been fighting amongst themselves for time immemorial, and the notion of what is the best way to create a state. I mean, going back to Plato's Republic, I mean, these ideas are not new. These ideas of how are we going to live together? What kind of a system can we set up so that we can, so that all people can be able to self-actualize themselves as human beings together, even if people are different from one another. And, we're still struggling with that question hundreds of years later. But for me, and maybe that's because I grew up just assuming the notion of universal human rights, that nation statism is an artificial construct. It's a cultural construct. It's not based in anything real. And so we need to struggle with what are the kinds of constructs we can create that will maximize the ability of different peoples to live together as equal citizens and in respect. And it's not going to be perfect, but certainly basing the identity of a state on one group of people over another is a recipe for oppression and dominance.
And a component of that which does not emphasize on the commonness of humanity and respect for all human beings as equal human beings and their rights to choose for what they choose to believe instead of imposing a certain set which one group comes up on the other.
And the other thing I want to point out is that, I talked about universal human rights as a modern concept, but in my sacred tradition, and I'm sure in yours as well, I mean, one of the first spiritual lessons we learn in the Torah is that when God created humanity, God created everybody in God's image. All human beings were created in the divine image, which is, to me, the central assumption of the contemporary notion of human rights, that all people have dignity and worth and value in the eyes of God. So if we believe that, then how do we create systems that honor that divine reality?
Changing to a little bit from such a theoretical aspect to some personal thing again, what is it in your how you were raised? I mean, sometimes I find people who are active in peace justice movement, they have some background or parents have taught them certain teachings and they're raised in a particular way that peace and justice and movement and effort for that becomes a priority for them. So what do you dig into your past and your heritage, your ancestors, which brings you to this particular a major decision? Isn't this decision was not easy for you, although it happened gradually, but it had repercussions. And I agree with you, you didn't think through all the repercussions when you started on the path, but you felt whatever is the truth must be said.
Yeah, and the Zionism piece, the issue of Israel and Palestine was one piece of it, where I ended up diverging from the narratives, the sacred narratives that I was taught and that were instilled in me as a young person. But I would say overall, I mean, my parents, the family I grew up in, like many Americans of that generation, were quite liberal, who were diehard Democrats. I remember our next door neighbor in 1968 had a big Nixon Now sign on their front lawn, and my mom wanted to go over there and tear it down. And both of my parents, but I think my mother in particular, had just a fierce discomfort with the world as it was. And when there were problems in the world, she took it very personally. She had her causes that she was very devoted to. I think gun control was a big one for her, and but others as well. And it was always clear to me that for both of them, their Jewish identity, they connected it very clearly to their experience as Jews, both historical experience and the sacred teachings of Judaism that I was raised with. So I think by and large, I'm very much, even though I diverged from some of the issues around Israel that were instilled in me, I think by and large, I'm very much a product of my parents. And, to their credit, they saw the struggles that I was going through as a rabbi, as an adult rabbi, and they were willing to be challenged by it. And I remember one of the things I'll never forget. I wrote an op-ed for the Chicago Tribune in the fall of 2009, and at the time there was a UN human rights inquiry into Israel's behavior during their military actions in Gaza, and it was known as Judge Goldstone was the head of that inquiry, and he came out with a very the Goldstone report. It was very condemnatory of Israel, and people were calling him anti-Semitic and excoriating him, even though he was a South African Jewish jurist who considered himself a Zionist. And I wrote an op-ed in the Tribune on the eve of Yom Kippur, which is our Day of Atonement, supporting the Goldstone report and saying that Jews needed to atone for what was done in Gaza to Palestinians. And it was pretty strong. And I remember my parents were staying with us because it was the holidays and they were attending services at my synagogue. And I remember I was reading it downstairs with my coffee, and my mother came downstairs and I showed her the paper and I said, well, what do you think of this? And she read it and she said, well, I think you said what needed to be said.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that meant a great deal to me. Not only because, every child wants their parents' approval, but on a deeper level, just that she was so willing, given what she had been through as in her own Jewish upbringing and experience, that she was able to go to that place. Part of it might have been that this was her son, the rabbi, that she was proud of, but I don't think it was mostly that. I think it was that she, she's an example of someone saying in her heart, knowing that this needed to be said, and was able to articulate that. Was really very special to me.
Really, I can only imagine how much it matters for me.
Yeah.
Matters for you. And even now, although my mom has passed away a long time ago, sometime I'm down and my mom, I visualize her appearing in her best clothes and encouraging me to, up. So children are never liberated from their parents, their imagination. Let's do 101 of Judaism for the Muslim community. What's the difference between Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews? Reform Jews, and you were part of the new constructionist movement, and now I would say non-Zionist Judaism.
So I think like most traditions, because Judaism is such a huge religious, there's a huge religious spectrum that we call Judaism and the Jewish religion. There's many different ways to be Jewish, and there always has been throughout Jewish history. And I would say in the modern period, what happened out of European Jewry, at least, when modernity swept through Europe, there was the beginning of what we would call today denominations of Judaism, which didn't exist quite formally in the same way before. And also it doesn't exist in other parts of the world. So Jews who grew up in Arab lands, like if we're talking about Syrian Jews or Egyptian Jews or what are known as Mizrahi Jews, Jews from Eastern countries like Morocco or Yemen. That's a whole nother Jewish reality, but I'm a product of European Jewry, and in European Jewry was very transformed by the modern period and the ideas of modernity. And so Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, and then later Reconstructionism were all, I would say, Jewish responses, religious responses to modernity, to the challenge of physical science, social science, history, new forms of understanding history, new ways of understanding God, new theologies, new modern theologies that were more humanistic. All of these things gave rise to new movements of Judaism that kind of went from a spectrum from more conservative to more progressive and liberal. So the Orthodox and conservative being on the more conservative end of that spectrum, Reform much more liberal. Reconstructionism was a uniquely American movement. It was born and grew up in the United States, and was from its very beginning an attempt to understand what it meant to be Jewish, growing up in a pluralistic democratic country like the United States. So I grew up in a Reform temple, but I chose the Reconstructionist movement as an adult. It's where I went to my rabbinic training. And Reconstructionism, I think one of the hallmarks of Reconstructionism is the notion that Judaism has always been evolving. It's always been not just one faith tradition, but an entire evolving religious civilization that has taken in and synthesized many of the ideas and practices and understandings of the cultural worlds in which Jews have lived throughout history. And that as Americans, we need to synthesize Judaism with the kinds of values that we've been talking about, democracy, equal rights, pluralism, dignity of all people. Reconstructionism is also very notable for that we have done away with the Jewish idea of Jews as a chosen people of God, that we are somehow God's elect more than any other. So Mordechai Kaplan, who was the founder of our movement, found that it was possible to reconstruct these ideas in many, many different ways in the modern period. But the notion of chosenness was, he believed, was just so exceptionalist inherently, and so rooted in this notion of this centrism of one people over another, that we've done away with all the references to Jews as a chosen people in our liturgy and seeing all people as chosen of God in their way.
So we just, time is up, essentially.
I'm sure I opened a huge can of worms with that little comment at the end of our conversation.
One last question will be just very short answer. So in America, most Jews are Reform Jews, right?
The largest single denomination of affiliated Jews is Reform, but I would say the largest group of Jews are unaffiliated, organized religion, much like I would say in the Christian Protestant world, the largest group is called unaffiliated, so to speak. But for those who do belong to synagogues, the Reform movement is the largest. Yeah.
And what about Israel itself?
Israel has a whole different Jewish religious reality. Israel, from its very beginning, there was a strong dichotomy between the secular and the very, very religious from the outset. The notion of these kinds of denominations that I'm talking about just didn't really exist in Israel. I mean, they do, but they're not particularly powerful. And I think they're largely seen as American ways of being Jewish, and to the extent that they exist in Israel, they're sort of American imports. But in Israel, you're either Chiloni, which is Hebrew for secular, or Dati, which is religious. And Israel was founded by the Chilonim, the original founders, people like David Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann and others, were all very, very fiercely secular Jews. Well,
thank you so much, Rabbi Brant Rosen. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so glad we had this opportunity, Malik. Anytime.
This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I have been talking with Rabbi Brant Rosen. I was about to call him Imam Brant Rosen.
I answer to many names.
And you're watching Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Roku. And Muslim Network is always on muslimnetwork.tv and social media. And thank you so much for Aliza Majid, who is our intern producer, for a great job you have done. Thank you. Peace. Salam.
Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.